Welcome to part 2 of the Biology 6 lecture on the immune system. At the end of part 1, we finished talking about the innate or non-specific immune system.
And so remember, that's the one where the cells and organs are not specialists in any one particular pathogen type. They are general body defenses. And so now we're going to look at the other branch of your immune system, the adaptive one. So this is the specific one. All right, so the adaptive immune system, also known as the specific immune system, the defense system, that consists of the lymphocyte white blood. So I guess I should mention that first. All right, so getting back to, here we go. So these are the 5 types of white blood cells: neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, monocytes, and lymphocytes. So the cells of your adaptive immune system are just the lymphocytes, these guys right here. And each lymphocyte is a specialist in fighting one and only one specific pathogen type. So just as an example, maybe this lymphocyte right here, its job is to fight, and I'm just making this up, influenza virus strain A6. And so that's the only pathogen that particular lymphocyte cell will fight. And maybe this lymphocyte right here, maybe his job is to fight Streptococcus bacteria strain P32.1b5. And so that's the only pathogen that particular lymphocyte is programmed to fight, is Streptococcus bacteria strain P32.1b5. And this lymphocyte right here, he's a specialist also. His job, let's say, is to fight hepatitis virus strain Q7. And so that's the only pathogen that particular lymphocyte would fight. So that's why they call them your specific defense, because it's made out of these lymphocyte cells, but each and every lymphocyte specializes in fighting one and only one particular pathogen type. And you should be kind of amazed by that, because there are thousands of different pathogens out there in the world. There's thousands of different strains of bacteria and thousands of different viruses that could potentially infect you. And so you have thousands of different lymphocytes, each one a specialist in fighting just one particular pathogen type. And so for any pathogen that happens to infect your body, you're going to have one or maybe even a few lymphocytes that are able to fight that pathogen for you, that are specialized in fighting that pathogen for you. And if you think about it, you have lymphocytes in your body that you're never going to use, just because you've never been, you might live your whole life and never be exposed to that particular pathogen. Just as an example, there's some bacteria that can cause a disease called meningitis, and hopefully nobody in this room will ever be exposed to that particular pathogen. But if you do, then you already have some lymphocytes that are programmed to fight that pathogen, and hopefully you'll live your entire life and never use those lymphocytes, but you've got them. Okay, so adaptive immune system is the specific one. Its cells are the lymphocyte white blood cells, and each lymphocyte specializes in fighting one and only one pathogen type. Okay, now there are 2 subcategories of these lymphocyte cells, and they're called B cells and T cells. But that doesn't change the fact that all lymphocytes are specialists in fighting. Each one fights one particular pathogen. So what I'm saying is you have thousands of different B cell lymphocytes, and each of those B cells is a specialist in fighting one particular pathogen type. And you have thousands of different T cell lymphocytes, and each of those T cell lymphocytes is also a specialist in fighting one and only one particular pathogen type for you. Okay, so yeah, the cells of your adaptive immune system are lymphocytes, but they come in 2 types, B cells and T cells. And the difference really is between a B cell and T cell is how it fights the pathogens for you. The B cells use a different strategy of fighting the pathogens than the T cells do. All right, so let's look at the B cells first, the B cell lymphocytes first. All right, so here's how B cell lymphocytes fight the pathogens for you. Notice this B cell that I sketched out here has these little Y-shaped things sticking out of it. Those are called antibodies. And that's what these B cells use to fight pathogens for you. B cells make and secrete these Y-shaped proteins called antibodies, and the antibodies have binding sites for the antigens on the pathogen that the B cell is programmed to fight. So, just as an example, let's say that this is a B cell and the pathogen it's programmed to fight, and again, I'm just making this up, is influenza virus strain 27. All right, so that's the pathogen that this B cell is programmed to fight. Well, so if that's the pathogen that this B cell is programmed to fight, the antibodies that this B cell makes only have binding sites for the foreign antigens on influenza virus strain P27. Yeah, so it's what makes this B cell a specialist in fighting just its pathogen is that its antibodies have binding sites for just the foreign antigens of that particular pathogen. Oh, and just as an aside here, sometimes when I ask students quiz questions or final exam questions on the immune system, I think they sometimes mix up antibodies and antigens. So antigens just means any molecule that you find on the surface of the cell, and those are molecules that the immune system interacts with to figure out whether that's a pathogen cell or one of the body's own cells. So all cells have antigens, but only B cells have antibodies. The antibodies are these Y-shaped proteins that will stick to the foreign antigens on the pathogen. Okay, yeah, so when a B cell encounters the pathogen that B cell is programmed to fight, the B cell secretes its antibodies, and those antibodies travel through the blood and the lymph fluids. They travel through the blood and the lymph, and then they stick to the foreign antigens on this pathogen that the B cell is programmed to fight. There's this term humoral immune system. The term humoral immune system means your B cells and the antibodies that the B cells secrete. The B cells plus the antibodies is your humoral immune system. Now, you might wonder, well, how exactly do those antibody proteins sticking to the antigens, how does that help fight off the pathogen? And I'll talk about exactly how the antibodies help get rid of the pathogen here in a few minutes, but let me kind of give you a preview first. So here's two different pathogens. Well, it's the same type of pathogen, but two copies of the pathogen, so to speak. And here's an antibody that's going to be against these pathogens. So each antibody is Y-shaped, and each point of the Y is a binding site for the foreign antigens of those pathogens. And so notice that because each antibody is Y-shaped and has two binding sites, it's able to link together two pathogen cells, right? When this antibody comes along, it can stick to the antigen on this pathogen cell and simultaneously the antigen on this pathogen cell. So it can link those two pathogen cells together. And that's one way in which the antibodies slow down the spread of the pathogen inside your body by linking pathogens together that immobilizes them by tying them up, basically. And as I said, I'll go over this a second time in a few minutes, but that's at least one way the antibodies slow down the spread of the pathogen inside your body. All right, so B cells and their antibodies, their humoral immune system. The other branch of your adaptive immune system are your T cells. And that branch of your adaptive immune system that's made of the T cells is sometimes called your cell-mediated immune system. Cool. So the B cell branch of your adaptive immune system is the humoral immune system, the B cells and their antibodies, and the T cell part is your cell-mediated immune system branch of your adaptive immune system. Okay, so so the B cells are the ones that fight the pathogens by secreting antibodies. The T cells fight the pathogens in a more direct way. T cells just simply go up right next to the pathogen, just got in contact with it, and they start secreting toxins into the inside of the pathogen, and that ends up killing off the pathogen. It's pretty much that simple. The T in T cell does not officially stand for toxins, but if that helps you remember that the T cells secrete the toxins, that's a fine way to think about it. Now, notice that this is not phagocytosis. The T cell is not eating the pathogen, it's poisoning the pathogen. All right, so yeah, sometimes students confusely think, well, T cells are phagocytes. They're not. They kill off the pathogens by poisoning them, not eating them. Okay, quick review question here. B cells and T cells are both which type of white blood cell? Lymphocyte, yeah, so keep that in mind, that the B cells and T cells are both within the lymphocyte type of white blood cell. Oh, here's kind of a neat photograph, a microscopic photograph. In yellowy colored here, golden colored there, that's a pathogen cell of some type. And the green colored cells are the T cells, and you can see the T cells have come up and attached themselves to the outside of the pathogen cell, and all those T cells you see there are busy secreting toxins into the pathogen cell here. Kind of neat. Okay, one more thing about the adaptive immune system is the adaptive immune system has what they call memory. And what that means is if the cells of your adaptive immune system, your B cells and T cells, have fought off a pathogen in the past, then they've learned how to fight off that pathogen so effectively that you're never going to get sick from that particular pathogen ever again in your life. In other words, your ability to get immune to a sickness by having fought it off once is called the memory of your adaptive immune system. It attacks pathogens more quickly, more effectively if it's encountered that specific pathogen before. And so this kid, I guess, those measles I think he has, poor looking kid. But that's a good example. If you get exposed to measles, the first time your adaptive immune system has a big fight on its hands, but it eventually wins and fights off the measles. But after that, it has memory, and that particular pathogen, the measles pathogen, will never make you sick again because it's essentially learned how to fight off that pathogen. Now, incidentally, this ability of the adaptive immune system to have memory and fight off pathogens more quickly, more effectively, if you've seen them before, not only explains why you get immune to a disease if you've been exposed to it the first time, but it's also the basis for vaccinations, immunizations. When you get a vaccination against some disease, what they're actually giving you is a very weak form of the pathogen. It's such a weak form that what they're injecting you with does not give you the disease, but it's enough for your adaptive immune system to learn to fight off that disease. And so by getting the vaccination, in theory, you're not going to get sick from that particular pathogen because your immune system has already learned how to fight it. And incidentally, sometimes they don't even inject you with any of the living pathogens. Sometimes they just inject you with the antigens of the pathogen. And that's enough. Just seeing the antigens is enough for your immune system to learn how to fight off that particular pathogen. So you get protection even from just getting the antigens. And from my understanding, that's the way the COVID vaccination works. They're not injecting you with any of the virus. They're just injecting you with, mRNA, which is going to make some of the viral antigens, and that's enough for your immune system to learn how to fight off the COVID virus. Okay, so this slide kind of summarizes what we've learned so far. The immune system has this non-specific part, the innate immune system, and it has this more specific part, the adaptive immune system, which is made up of the lymphocyte white blood cells. But the adaptive immune system has two branches: humoral immune system, which is the B cells and the antibodies that they make, and the cell-mediated immune system, which is the T cells. Okay, so what we're going to do now is kind of drill down to the next level of detail. We're going to focus on the B cells and their antibodies and learn a little bit more exactly how how they function. Any burning questions so far about the adaptive immune system? All right. So the humoral immune system means your B cells and the antibodies that they make. And so this first block of text right here just summarizes what we already learned, that each B cell is a specialist in fighting one particular pathogen type. And so the way I tried to summarize this here is, you notice I gave each B cell different colored antibodies sticking out of its surface. And so that symbolizes that each of those B cells is different from all the others. Each one is a specialist in fighting one particular pathogen type. So each B cell makes and coats its surface with antibodies, and so each B cell's antibodies will stick to only one particular, the foreign antigens of only one particular pathogen. And so I'm just going to make up some names here, but let's say this B cell, it's a specialist in fighting, I don't know, Epstein-Barr virus strain S32, and what makes it a specialist is its antibodies only have binding sites for the foreign antigens of Epstein-Barr virus strain S32. And this B cell, it's a specialist in fighting meningitis bacteria strain 17, and what makes it a specialist is its antibodies only have binding sites for the foreign antigens of, what did I just say? Well, whatever antigen I said a second ago, and a senior moment. And let's say this B cell, what makes it let's say it's for fighting cholera bacteria strain 9, and what makes it a specialist is its antibodies only bind to the foreign antigens on cholera bacteria strain 9. Good. So thousands of different B cells, each one's a specialist in fighting one and only one particular pathogen, because the antibodies it coats itself with only have binding sites for the foreign antigens of that particular pathogen that the B cell is programmed to fight. All right, so let me make sure I got it. The B cell makes and coats its surface with antibodies that can bind to the foreign antigens of the pathogen that the B cell is programmed to fight. The B cells differ from each other in regards to which pathogen their antibodies bind to. You have thousands of different B cells, each one specialized in fighting a different pathogen than all the other B cells. Therefore, no matter which pathogen affects your body, you're going to have some B cells with antibodies that are able to fight that particular pathogen. Okay, so let's see that in action now. So let's say this represents all the thousands of B cells you have inside your body. And let's say one particular pathogen gets inside you. There's that pathogen. And you can see it has its foreign antigens on its surface. As that pathogen has infected your body, as that pathogen is moving around inside your body, it's going to bump into various types of B cells. And every time a B cell and that pathogen encounter each other, the B cell is going to test to see whether its antibodies are the ones that bind to the foreign antigens on that pathogen. That's how the B cells figure out if their particular pathogen has entered the body, is every time they run into a pathogen, they test whether their antibodies bind to its foreign antigens. And so let's say it starts off right here with this B cell right here. The B cell tests to see if its antibodies bind to the foreign antigens in this pathogen, and let's say they don't. So this B cell says, okay, that's not my pathogen, that's not the pathogen I'm programmed to fight, and so it's not my problem, not my job. So that B cell does nothing. And let's say this B cell also, it tests its antibodies, but they don't bind to that foreign antigen, so this B cell does nothing. And likewise, this B cell, its antibodies are not the ones that bind to that, so that B cell does nothing. And this B cell, its antibodies don't bind to the foreign antigens, so that B cell does nothing. But let's say this B cell is the one that fights this pathogen, meaning that this B cell's antibodies do have the right binding sites to stick to this, the foreign antigens in this pathogen. Well, so now that's how this B cell has figured out that its pathogen, the pathogen it's programmed to fight, has infected the body. So once a B cell has encountered the pathogen that has the foreign antigens that fit into its antibodies, in other words, once the B cell knows that its particular pathogen has infected the body, the first thing the B cell does is clone itself. It starts making copies of itself. And why is it doing that? Well, it wants to build up an army of itself to help fight off that pathogen for you. So that B cell, after it's encountered its pathogen, divides. And so now you have 2 of that B cell for fighting off that particular pathogen. And then each of those clones of the original B cell divide, and so now you have 4 B cells against that particular pathogen. Then each of those guys divide, and so now you have 8, then 16, then 32, then 64. And so they just keep cloning themselves. They keep just building up more and more of themselves to essentially build up a whole army of themselves to help you fight off that particular pathogen. And they keep cloning themselves. That particular B cell against the pathogen keeps dividing until there are millions and millions of copies of it. So you end up with millions and millions of identical clones of that original B cell. And all of them, they're exact clones of each other. So they all have the antibodies to fight that particular pathogen. And it doesn't happen instantaneously. When a pathogen enters your body, in other words, when you first get infected with the pathogen, it generally takes around 2 weeks for your B cells to clone themselves into millions of copies of themselves. So the first time you're exposed to the pathogen, it takes around 2 weeks for your B cells to build up against that pathogen to build up an army of themselves. Okay, once the cloning is completed, now those B cells are going to secrete their antibodies. And so let's say this represents that army of millions of B cells that have cloned themselves against that pathogen. And so, now they're going to start secreting those antibodies into your blood and into your lymph fluids. And so, now those antibodies will circulate throughout your body in the blood and the lymph and bind to those foreign the foreign antigens on the pathogen, and that's going to help kill off the pathogen. And here in a second, I'll talk a little bit more about exactly how those antibodies fight the pathogen for you. But before I get to that, I want to mention these things called memory B cells. So notice some of the B cells did not secrete their antibodies. Those are called memory B cells. And what they are is they're like a reserve army. Their job is to keep their antibodies. And so if at some point in the future you get infected by that same pathogen, you don't have to start from square one with just 1 or 2 B cells against that. You already have a small army of B cells built up against that pathogen, these memory B cells. So if you get infected the second time, at some point later in your life, if you get exposed to that pathogen a second time, it's not going to take 2 weeks to build up an army of B cells because you're already starting with a small army. Matter of fact, you'll already have antibodies against it and a whole bunch of B cells against it, so you're not even going to feel sick the second time you get exposed to it. You'll have such a rapid and strong defense thanks to these memory B cells that you're essentially immune to that pathogen. So these memory B cells, they are they're one of the reasons why your adaptive immune system has memory. They're one of the reasons why once you get sick from a pathogen the first time, that pathogen is not going to make you sick again because you already have a small army of these memory B cells against it. And this is a graph that shows that concept. The blue you can think of as representing B cells and their antibodies. And on this graph, this axis, they're showing how weeks in time. And so this right here at 0, that's when the person gets exposed to the pathogen. And so notice that it takes about 2 weeks for your B cells to clone themselves and build up millions of copies of themselves, right? 2 weeks there. And so after your B cells have fought off that pathogen, there's usually a decrease in the number of B cells you have against that particular pathogen. But notice that it never goes down to the same low level that it was before your first exposure. And so this right here, this higher level of B cells against the pathogen, those are your memory B cells. And you'll have those throughout the rest of your life. So if you get exposed to that same pathogen later, Notice, thanks to these memory B cells, you have an even bigger response than the first time you were exposed. And notice that it was very rapid. Instead of taking 2 weeks to reach its maximum level, this just looks like a day or two to reach its maximum level. And so that's so rapid and so strong a response that you don't even notice you've gotten sick the second time. You're immune to that pathogen thanks to your memory B cells. Okay, so again, the memory B cells are the ones that hold on to their antibodies. They don't join the fight against the pathogen, at least not the first fight against it. But notice that most of those clones of the B cell did secrete their antibodies into the blood and the lymph. And so let's see what happens to those B cells that are actively secreting their antibodies to fight off the pathogen for you. Okay, so here's a bunch of these pathogens. Let's say these are the pathogens that those B cells are making antibodies against. So the circulating antibodies bind to the foreign antigens on those pathogens. And so when I click the button, we'll see some antibodies coming in here. Here they come. At least I think they are. Come on, antibodies. Where are you? Here they are. So they're the antibodies. So remember that each antibody has 2 binding sites. They are Y-shaped proteins. And thanks to each antibody having 2 binding sites, they can end up linking the pathogen cells together. The official term for that is agglutination, or you say the antibodies agglutinate the pathogen cells, which means linking them together. And so the purpose of that, the benefit of that is it slows down the spread of those pathogens in the body. By hooking them up to each other, they can't spread as easily. And to make an analogy, back in the old days, they used to shackle prisoners together if the prisoners had to step outside the prison. You can see some shackles here. And so, by being all shackled together, the prisoners couldn't travel very far or very fast. It slowed them down. And so that's the same concept here. By agglutinating the pathogen cells, the antibodies slow down the spread of the pathogen in the body. But there's a second way that the antibodies help you fight off the pathogen, and it's this. Remember there was a protein in the blood called complement protein that can lyse pathogen cells, that can tear open pathogen cells. Well, what I didn't tell you at the time is the complement protein only lyses cells that have antibodies stuck to them. And so that's how your complement proteins know which cells they're supposed to destroy, is by looking for the antibodies. Or saying the same thing a slightly different way is you can think of the antibodies as sort of like destroy me flags. And so by antibodies sticking to these pathogen cells, they're marking those pathogen cells for the complement proteins to destroy. So here's the cartoon of that. Some antibodies have stuck to the foreign antigens on this pathogen cell, and that essentially marks this cell to the complement protein saying, hey, destroy this cell. And so now the complement proteins come in, and like guided missiles, I guess I was feeling imaginative when I made this lecture, like laser guided missiles, the complement proteins come in and will lyse pathogen cells that have antibodies stuck to them. Okay, so that was all about your humoral immune system, which is the B cells and their antibodies. Now we're going to take a closer look at the cell-mediated immune system, which is the T cells. And so remember, T cells. Oh, sorry. This is a figure from the textbook that shows what we talked about. And so here we see some B cells with their antibodies on their surface. And so when a pathogen, which is supposed to be the red dots in this, enters the body, the B cells that are against that pathogen, in other words, the B cells whose antibodies bind to that pathogen, clone themselves. And so, they end up making millions of copies of themselves. And some of those keep their antibodies. Those are the memory B cells. Those will help you fight off that pathogen if you get exposed to it a second time. But most of those cloned B cells secrete their antibodies into the blood and the lymph to help you deal with the first exposure to the pathogen. Okay, so all that was the humoral immune system. The part with the T cells is this called the cell-mediated immune system. And so remember these T cells don't make antibodies. The T cells kill off their pathogen cells by secreting toxins into the pathogen. Now, before I tell you a little bit about how the T cells do that, I first have to bring up monocytes and macrophages again. So remember that these monocytes are part of your non-specific immune system, your innate immune system. And remember, the monocytes themselves don't do any phagocytosis, but the monocytes turn themselves into a macrophage, and the macrophage does a lot of phagocytosis. So yeah, picture those macrophages just patrolling around your body, eating any pathogens that they find. So here's a pathogen, and that's infected the body, and here comes a macrophage. So the macrophage, it does what its job is. It eats the pathogen. But here's something that I didn't tell you the first time. When a macrophage eats a pathogen, the macrophage puts some of the pathogen's foreign antigens on its own surface. In other words, a macrophage decorates its own surface with some of the foreign antigens of the pathogen that it ate. And that should strike you slightly weird, because we don't do that when we eat things. You know, last night I had tacos for dinner, and so imagine when I ate those tacos, I took bits of the taco shell and the taco meat and stuck them all over my body. You'd think I was a weirdo, right? But you know, that's what macrophages do. Every time they eat something, they put bits of it on their surface. You know, or if I ate a pizza last night, imagine me taking pepperonis and pizza crust and cheese and just sticking them all over my body, so they can say, hey, look what I ate for dinner last night. I've got these bits stuck to me. Yeah, so that's what macrophages do. But every time they eat a pathogen, they stick the pathogen's foreign antigens on their own surface. And you might say, well, why in the world do they do it? Or is the macrophage doing it? It's pretty strange. Well, the macrophages do that because that's what allows the T cells against that particular pathogen to get activated. Okay, so you have thousands of different T cells in your body, each one a specialist in fighting one and only particular pathogen type. And so, you know, this is kind of similar in concept to what we saw with the B cells. So just to make some random examples here, let's say this T cell, it's programmed to fight only West Nile virus strain R27b, so that's the only pathogen it fights. And this T cell, it's programmed to fight, I don't know, what's another good, Streptococcus bacteria strain Q9b, and this T cell, it's only programmed to fight, I don't know, pneumococcus bacteria strain Q21b. So you have thousands of different T cells. Each one specializes in fighting one and only one pathogen. Well, for a T cell to figure out that its pathogen has infected the body, that T cell has to encounter a macrophage that's displaying the foreign antigens from its pathogen. And so that's why it's important for the macrophage to stick the foreign antigens of the pathogen it ate on its surface, so it can display those foreign antigens to all the T cells in the body, so that the T cell that's against that particular pathogen can become activated. So here you see the macrophage showing the foreign antigens to this T cell, and this T cell says, hey, that's not my pathogen, and so I'm not going to get involved in the fight. That's not my pathogen. And so now the macrophage goes up to this T cell, same thing. It shows it the foreign antigens of the pathogen it ate, and that T cell says, hey, that's not my pathogen. I'm not going to join the fight. And so the macrophage keeps doing that, showing those foreign antigens to each T cell that it encounters. It's looking for the T cell that is programmed to fight that particular pathogen that had those foreign antigens. Let's say that this T cell right here, that's the T cell that is programmed to fight the pathogen that makes those particular foreign antigens. So once the macrophage has showed that T cell the foreign antigens, this T cell now knows that its particular pathogen has infected the body. So let me not get ahead of myself. So just like we saw with the B cells, each T cell is different from each other in regard to which pathogen they attack. You have thousands of different T cells, each one specialized in fighting one particular pathogen. So whatever pathogen infects you, you'll have one or a few T cells against it. Okay, so a T cell that's against a particular pathogen only becomes activated to fight that pathogen when that T cell encounters a macrophage that's displaying the foreign antigens of the pathogen that T cell is supposed to fight. That's what happened to this T cell. Let me run it backwards for a second. There we go. The pathogen that this particular T cell fights is the pathogen that has these foreign antigens that are displayed by the macrophage. And so now this T cell knows that its pathogen has infected the body. And so we get a similar thing to what we saw with the B cells. Once a T cell has become activated, once it knows its pathogen is in the body, it starts cloning itself. So that T cell makes an exact clone of itself, so now we have 2 of that T cells against the pathogen, then those divide, those clone themselves, so now you have 4 T cells against that pathogen, then those divide, then you have 8, then 16, and 32. They just keep cloning themselves. And it takes only about a week, but after that week you'll have millions and millions of clones of that original T cell, and all of those clones are specialists in fighting that particular pathogen. So in other words, these T cells have built up an army of millions of themselves to go fight that particular pathogen. There they go. Just like we saw with the B cells, some of these T cells stay around as what we call memory T cells. And again, the same thing. Their job is to just wait. And so if at some point in the future you get infected by that same pathogen, then you won't have to start from just 1 or 2 T cells against it. You've already got a small army of T cells against it. So on your second encounter with that pathogen, you'll be immune to it. You're not even going to feel sick because you already have so many T cells against it. All right, so that's what the memory T cells do. They just kind of sit around and wait for the second encounter. But let's follow those T cells that are fighting in the first encounter with the pathogen. So these are the ones that are going to pull up next to the pathogen and secrete toxins into the pathogen. And that particular type of T cell, the ones that secrete the toxins into the pathogen, have a name. They're called the cytotoxic T cells, which the name sort of makes sense. Cyto means cell and toxic means toxic. And so those are the cells that inject toxins into the pathogen cell. Good. Yeah, so those T cells kill off their pathogen by secreting, I should say the cytotoxic T cells kill off the pathogen by secreting toxins into it. All right, so we've got your cytotoxic T cells that do exactly that, and the memory T cells that don't do that, at least not on the first encounter with the pathogen. These are the ones that kind of wait on the sidelines for a second encounter with the pathogen. There's a third type of T cell that's different still from these other two, and this third type is called helper T cells. So let me explain these helper T cells. Oh, so I guess I showed you this photograph before. In golden colored there is the pathogen cell, and in green you see some cytotoxic T cells that have fastened themselves onto the outside of the pathogen, and they're busy in secreting toxins into the pathogen. Okay, but I was going to tell you about these helper T cells. All right, so remember that when a B cell has encountered the pathogen that B cell is programmed to fight, the B cell starts cloning itself. It starts dividing and dividing and dividing to build up an army of itself. And the same with the cytotoxic T cell. When it figures out that its pathogen has infected the body, that cytotoxic T cell will start cloning itself, building up dividing, building up an army of millions of copies of itself. So I told you that before, that these guys clone themselves when they encounter their pathogen. But what I didn't tell you before is this: to be able to divide, to be able to clone themselves, not only do they have to have encountered their pathogen, but they need some assistance in cloning themselves from this type of cell called a helper T cell. And so that's the job of helper T cells. They are what allow the B cells and cytotoxic T cells to clone themselves, to reproduce themselves. And so if this B cell has encountered its pathogen, then the helper T cell, if this T cell has encountered its pathogen, and this B cell has encountered its pathogen, that helper T cell is what allows them to make copies of themselves, and allows them to clone themselves. So notice that these helper T cells are very important for the proper functioning of your immune system. Here we go. Even though the helper T cell in and of itself does not attack any pathogens, it very much helps you fight off the pathogens by allowing the activated T cells and activated B cells to clone themselves. Or maybe saying the same thing in a slightly different way is if for some reason you did not have any helper T cells, your immune system would not be very functional because none of your B cells and T cells could ever clone themselves. And without that, they couldn't fight off pathogens very effectively. And the reason I'm making such a big deal out of that is in AIDS disease, the virus that causes the disease kills off the person's helper T cells. And so that's why people with AIDS lose their immune system. The virus kills off the helper T cells, so in AIDS victims, their B cells and T cells can't divide, and so those people effectively lose the ability to fight off any pathogens. We're now switching topics slightly. You know, I've been talking about the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system, and these two branches of the adaptive immune system, the humoral immune system and the cell-mediated immune system. You know, obviously don't forget all that, but we're going to switch our focus a little bit and talk about things called detrimental immune system reactions. So the word detrimental means harmful. And so there are situations where your immune system can end up harming you. And it usually harms you because it's overactive. It's more active than it's supposed to be. And at first that seems a little counterintuitive. You might say, well, my immune system is there to protect me against pathogens, and so don't I want it maximally active, you know, to protect me from pathogens even more? Well, I guess everything has balance, and it is possible for the immune system to be overactive, and that can harm you. One example of such a thing are things called autoimmune diseases. And so I think I mentioned these before. Autoimmune diseases are where your immune system is so overactive, it starts attacking your own tissues. Or maybe I should say the immune system gets confused, and it thinks some of your self-antigens are foreign antigens, so it starts attacking your own tissues that happen to have that particular self-antigen. That person you saw a second ago had multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is an example of an autoimmune disease. In multiple sclerosis, the immune system gets confused and starts attacking the myelin material that coats axons of neurons. And so here you see some antibodies attacking some of the myelin, and it ends up, well, destroying the myelin sheath on the axons of neurons. And without that myelin sheath, the neurons can't carry signals correctly. So people with multiple sclerosis start losing the ability to control their muscles because of the loss of myelin from their motor neurons. And another example of one of these autoimmune diseases is rheumatoid arthritis. In rheumatoid arthritis, the immune system gets confused and starts attacking the hyaline cartilage that keeps your joints running smoothly. And so as the immune system destroys the hyaline cartilage, the joints can become painful to use and eventually just get frozen in place. And here's another autoimmune disease. There's an autoimmune disease called lupus. And again, it's an autoimmune disease. The immune system is attacking the body's own tissues. Lupus is more a general autoimmune disease. Many different organs and tissues in the body get attacked by the immune system in lupus. Here's another example of detrimental immune system reactions. You know, again, where the immune system is overreactive. Allergies. Allergies are where the immune system has a reaction to things that are actually harmless, things that are not pathogens at all. To give you an example, some people have allergies to pollen. You know, pollen is plant reproductive cells, and those are not pathogens at all. That, you know, pollen can't actually hurt you in and of itself. But with some people, their immune system thinks that the pollen is a pathogen. And so the person gets exposed to the pollen, they start having a big immune response, and typically they get what they call rashes on the skin, which are called hives, and watery eyes and noses, and itching and asthma. A lot of that comes from the histamines. You might remember that basophil white blood cells secrete molecules called histamines, which make capillaries leaky. And so a lot of these effects from the allergy are from the histamines. And so you might have heard of people taking antihistamines if the person has a bad allergy that they can get antihistamines to block some of those effects. But unfortunately, some people have such a severe allergy to certain things that it could be life-threatening. And if that's the case, we say that the person has anaphylactic shock. So some people, for example, have an extreme allergic reaction to peanuts. And so if they get exposed to peanuts, their immune system has such a big response that it can actually kill the person. And with other people, a bee sting could put them into anaphylactic shock, or sometimes antibiotics like penicillin could put a person into anaphylactic shock. One more example. Oh, this was interesting. I mentioned that I have a friend who's allergic to cat hair. That's not my friend. But I just saw this on the internet, and I thought it was also a good example. This woman is allergic to horse hair, and so it very severely so that they could send her into anaphylactic shock. And so, as you can imagine, she avoids horses, quite sensibly. Well, what I read on her story on the internet, she is a college student, or she was a college student at the time, and so she sat down in a chair in the classroom, much like you are sitting now, and all of a sudden she went into anaphylactic shock and had to be rushed to the hospital. And what they eventually found out is the person who sat in that chair the day before had been riding a horse. And I thought, boy, that's very sensitive. So, she's allergic to horse hair, and she didn't touch the horse, and she didn't even touch the person who touched the horse. She touched the chair of the person who had touched the horse. But that's how sensitive she was. That sent her into anaphylactic shock. Anyway, so these allergies, no matter how severe they are yet another case where we wish the immune system was a little bit less active. And one final example, some people receive organ transplants. For instance, a person might receive a heart transplant or a kidney transplant or a bone marrow transplant. I think they can also transplant livers into people. Well, oftentimes what happens is when they give this person a new organ, the immune system attacks the new organ. Why? Well, that's not the person's own heart, so it's a foreign substance coming into the body, and so the person's body sees the antigens on those new heart cells as foreign antigens, in which they are to that person's body. And so the person's immune system often will attack the transplanted organ. And that's called rejection of the organ. And so yet again, when those people wish that their immune system was less active so that it wouldn't attack these organs that they need, right? Okay, so so all of these are examples of where the immune system is more active than we want it to be, so it's actually harming us. What's to be done about it? Well, the answer to that is something called immunosuppression. Immunosuppression means where medical drugs are given to the person. I'll skip the disease part for right now, I'll come back to that. But immunosuppression means where medical drugs are given to the person, and these drugs will weaken the person's immune system. So, if the doctors feel the person needs to have a less active immune system, like the person has an autoimmune disease or is getting an organ transplant, the doctors can give the person drugs to weaken their immune system so they don't have the autoimmune disease, or their body doesn't reject the organ. All right, so what exactly are these drugs that suppress the immune system? Well, we talked about some of these already. There's a family of hormones called the glucocorticoids. Within this family of glucocorticoid hormones, you have one is called cortisol, another one's called cortisone. And so these hormones, the glucocorticoids, lower the person's overall immune system activity. So if the patient, is suffering from an autoimmune disease, or the patient just got an organ transplant, the doctors might give the person an injection of glucocorticoids. And you can also buy them as an over-the-counter cream. Here's a photograph a drawing of one of these glucocorticoid hormones. As you can see, it's a steroid hormone. Anyway, you can buy these also as over-the-counter creams. And so if you have a rash on your skin where your immune system is reacting to something that has contacted your skin, like poison oak or a jellyfish sting or something, you can put these creams on it, and that will at least partially relieve the immune response that you're having on your skin. Now, yeah, we talked about these glucocorticoid hormones when we talked about the endocrine system a few weeks back. And you might remember, just as kind of a review, the glucocorticoids are made by your adrenal gland to help you deal with what they call long-term stress. Those long-term stress are things that stress you out, but that you don't consider life-threatening, like unpaid bills or final exams coming up or things like that, are long-term stress. And yeah, your adrenal gland secretes glucocorticoids to help you through these periods of stress. But, you know, one side effect of those glucocorticoids is that they do weaken your immune system. So living a stressful life weakens your immune system. So my advice to you is try not to live stressful lives, you know. I mean, none of us do that on purpose, of course, but as much as you can control how stressful your life is, you will have a stronger immune system if you reduce your stress. Now, if the patient needs stronger immunosuppression than the glucocorticoids can provide, there are more powerful drugs, more powerful immunosuppressants. As one example, there's this drug here called methotrexate, and it's also given to suppress the immune system. What methotrexate actually does is inhibit cell division in the body, because remember that for your immune system to work correctly, B cells and T cells have to clone themselves, have to reproduce themselves when they've encountered their pathogen in your body. And so, yeah, so methotrexate blocks cell division, so it stops B and T cells from reproducing themselves, and so that inhibits the immune system. Now, when the doctors are giving immunosuppressant drugs to a person, you know, let's say the person has an autoimmune disease or the person just received an organ transplant, the doctors don't want to give too much of the immunosuppressant. Now, who can tell me why would that be a bad thing if the doctors gave too much of the immunosuppressant drug? What would happen to the patient? I think I heard it. What was that again? They'd get sick, right. The doctors don't want to completely wipe out the patient's immune system, because then the patient would get sick from the pathogens of the environment. Because remember that we're constantly surrounded by pathogens. The air is full of them. Every surface you touch is full of them. All your drinks and food have pathogens on them. Yeah, so if the doctors gave too much of these drugs and fully wiped out the patient's immune system, then the patient would get sick and maybe even die just from pathogens in the environment. So what I've been talking about so far in immunosuppression is when the doctors give these immunosuppressant drugs to, you know, help the person out with their autoimmune disease or an organ transplant. There's also, so, you know, that's a good use of immunosuppressant to help the patient. There's also a bad side of it. There are certain pathogens, certain diseases, where the pathogen attacks and destroys the person's immune system. And so, you know, that's not a good thing. That's not a medical treatment. That's just a pathogen wiping out the person's immune system. And by far the most common example of such a thing is this disease called AIDS. It's called acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, is what that stands for. And it's a terrible disease. It's caused by a virus called the HIV virus. And this virus first came into the human population in the 80s. And it essentially destroys just one type of cell. Remember those helper T cells that help other cells reproduce? The virus only infects and destroys helper T cells, but those helper T cells are so critical to the proper functioning of the immune system. When the virus wipes out the helper T cells, it essentially eliminates the whole person's immune system. And so that's the way the virus kills the person just by eliminating the person's immune system. The HIV virus is spread by bodily fluids. So if one person's bodily fluids get inside another person, and that first person was HIV positive, had the virus, then when those body fluids are passed between the two, the next person will get the virus and become HIV positive. So common ways that the virus is spread, through body fluids, are unprotected sex, which just basically means sex where there's no condom blocking the body fluids from passing through. The HIV virus also spreads among intravenous drug users because they often share needles with each other. And so if one person uses the needle, that gets some blood on the needle. Then if they pass the needle to somebody else, then they're passing some of their blood, and that is how the virus can be transmitted. In the early years of the AIDS epidemic, people who would go into the hospital and get blood transfusions would sometimes get HIV from the transfusion blood. This was because it was early enough in the AIDS epidemic that hospitals were unaware that HIV could be transmitted in the blood supply. And so they didn't have as many safeguards as they could have. But that's really not a risk anymore. Hospitals very thoroughly screen their blood, and so the chance of you getting HIV from a blood transfusion these days is almost zero. All right, so if a person does get infected with the virus, the HIV virus, so just to be clear, the AIDS is the disease where the immune system has been destroyed, and HIV is the virus that causes the disease. So if a person gets infected with the HIV virus, remember what I said, that the HIV virus only actually kills their helper T cells. And so let's look at that. So here's these B cells and T cells, and let's say these B cells and T cells are going to fight some pathogen, so they're ready to divide. And so the job of the helper T cell is to help them divide, to make them divide. But here is this HIV virus. So yeah, the HIV virus only infects helper T cells. The HIV virus does not affect B cells or cytotoxic T cells or monocytes or basophils or eosinophils or neutrophils. It only infects helper T cells. But when it does infect those helper T cells, it essentially kills off the helper T cell. The virus starts reproducing inside that helper T cell, and that will eventually destroy the helper T cell. And so now the body has one less helper T cell, and those viruses that got reproduced inside that helper T cell will now spread to other helper T cells and destroy those helper T cells. So what I'm saying is, if a person gets infected with the HIV virus, it doesn't instantly kill off all their helper T cells because it takes a while for the virus to spread and kill off from one helper T cell to another. And so there's a period typically of years where the person who's HIV positive still feels completely healthy because the virus is not yet wiped out all of their helper T cells. And they call that the latency period. And on average, it lasts for 10 years. So from the point of HIV infection to the point where the person just runs out of helper T cells, that's the latency period, and on average, 10 years. And even though 10 years is the average latency period before the immune system is fully wiped out, it varies quite a bit from one person to another. Now, as an example of differences in latency period, so actually, do you guys know who this is? Freddie Mercury, yeah. So you guys are so much younger than me. I don't know if you knew some of the bands that I knew when I was growing up, but there was this band called Queen, and he was the front man for the band, Freddie Mercury. And so he was diagnosed as being HIV positive in 1987, and he died 4 years later, what is that, 1991, he died of it. So his latency period was 4 years before it wiped out his immune system. His partner, Jim Hutton there on your right, also became HIV positive at about the same time, but Jim lasted 20 years. His latency period was 20 years. So the point I'm making is that, yeah, latency period, the average is 10 years, but it varies quite a bit from one person to another. Now, during the latency period, the person still has some helper T cells, and so their immune system is still able to function. And the person doesn't really feel that they are sick. They might not even know that they're HIV positive. Matter of fact, oftentimes they don't know that they're HIV positive. And so because they don't have any symptoms, and oftentimes they're not aware that they're HIV positive, then they might, through unprotected sex or sharing needles, unknowingly pass the virus to other people. Now, so at the end of the latency period, that's defined as when all the helper T cells are gone, and at that point, you now say the person has the AIDS disease. Before they were just HIV positive, but they still had some immune system, so they didn't have AIDS yet. But at the end of the latency period, no more helper T cells. They now officially have AIDS disease. And at that point, they can no longer defend themselves against pathogens because their B cells and cytotoxic T cells can no longer multiply, without the help of those helper T cells. And so what the person actually dies of are pathogens in the environment, pathogens that you or I, with a healthy immune system, can easily fight off, but they essentially have no defenses against them without their, helper T cells. And so, yeah, they'll just die of harmless pathogens in the environment. The most common actual cause of death is pneumonia. Every time you breathe in, you're breathing in some pathogens into your lungs. You have a healthy immune system, so you don't get sick, but if you didn't have an immune system, like an AIDS victim, then, yeah, just breathing in air would give you pneumonia and eventually cause your death. So it's been a terrible epidemic. I was just looking at the statistics a few days ago. Over 40 million people have died of AIDS since the beginning of the epidemic. And just to put that in perspective, about 5 million people have died of COVID worldwide. So what is that? Eight times as many people have died of HIV than of COVID. They've developed some drugs to treat people who are HIV positive. Basically, these drugs prolong the latency period. So instead of, 10 years is the average if the person's not getting any drugs to treat it. If the person is taking drugs, it extends the latency period for much longer, so much so that the person will have a near normal lifespan. I guess I don't know exactly what the latency period is if they are taking the most modern drugs, but it's decades and decades and decades, so the person will have a near normal lifespan. Now, that person who's getting the anti-HIV drugs still has to be careful of their lifestyle. They still don't want to infect family members or other people with the virus. They still have to be careful, but it at least delays for many decades the development of the actual AIDS disease. Now, unfortunately, some of these drugs are very expensive, and so they tend to be given to people in developing countries who can afford them, and not so much into people they give them to people in developed countries, and unfortunately, people in developing countries oftentimes can't afford them. Okay, well, that might be the end of what we're going to talk about on the immune system. Okay, well, I'll just finish off by saying, I was talking here about the HIV virus being potentially spread through body fluids, and it certainly can. But there are, of course, many different pathogens that can be spread through contact with body fluids. Just to name one, the hepatitis virus can be easily spread through body fluids. So some of you, I know, are planning to go into the medical field, and you're going to be exposed to all sorts of body fluids from your patients, blood and feces and vomit and mucus. And so it's very important when you go into your medical field to practiced proper body substance isolation to make sure that you protect yourself by wearing gloves and masks and other things to stop those patient's bodily fluids infecting you. Okay, well, so that's then the end of what we're going to talk about on the immune system.